if there was one doctrine or one event that could be described as pivotal to the Christian faith, it would be the resurrection. The resurrection of Christ from the grave is not just a side issue. In fact, it is crucial to our faith. The cross is, of course, vital and important, but without the resurrection, the cross becomes meaningless. The Apostle Paul said, "And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." So you can see that to Paul, the resurrection was vital. Richard Niebuhr puts it this way: apart from the resurrection of Jesus, the eschatological orientation of the church appears as the spoke of a wheel without a hub. So, in other words, very simply said, the resurrection of Jesus is the hub upon which the entire Christian faith revolves, around that hub, which is the truth of the resurrection. The great Christian apologist Josh McDowell, who is a modern Christian apologist, set out initially to disprove Christianity. He was very skeptical of the Christian faith, especially the faith in the resurrection of Jesus. And so he set out to investigate the Christian record, to investigate the historical records, and in order that he could then mount a case against Christianity. But what he found surprised him. And in fact, he became convinced, as he looked at the matter more closely, that indeed the claims of the gospel were true. He did a complete about-face and became a believer, because he said, "I cannot see this evidence and ignore it or not make a choice regarding it. I have to say, as I see this evidence, that it is true, and I believe it," and he became a Christian. And he went on to write a book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. So here is a man who has set out to discredit the claims of Christ, and yet instead became a believer, because he looked honestly at the gospel record and at the claims of Christ. That was enough for him to become convinced that it is indeed true. In his investigations, Josh found that both the Jewish and Roman sources admit an empty tomb. That became kind of one of the central things that convinced Josh McDowell. The empty tomb. No body ever was found of Jesus. And the Jewish and the Roman authorities and sources both acknowledge this. And you would think that if anybody was going to say, "Oh, well, that wasn't so," they would. But they acknowledge that truth. Josh puts it this way: if they, meaning the disciples, had connived a scheme, and Christ had not been raised from the dead, where would have been the hardest place on the face of the earth to convince anyone? It would have been in Jerusalem, where they had seen Jesus die upon the cross, and where it would have been pretty easy to uncover any kind of a trick or a plot on behalf of the disciples. The thing that became also very compelling for Josh McDowell was that the early Christians were so adamant that they had witnessed the risen Jesus. They staunchly stood by that claim. We've seen him. We're his witnesses. They were willing to face persecution. They were willing to face death and threats of death. all for their faith that Jesus is alive and risen. He writes, as a reward for their efforts, those early Christians were beaten, stoned, put to death, thrown to the lions, tortured, and crucified. Every conceivable method was used to stop them from talking. Clearly, something very powerful occurred, and nothing was able to deter the early Christians and the disciples from their faith that Jesus had risen from the dead. Erling C. Olson writes, whoever reads the New Testament seriously or gives thought to the impact which the apostles made on their generation must acknowledge that one outstanding historic event alone spurred that small band of 11 ordinary men to an amazing task of evangelizing their generation. Defying every obstacle, loss of home, persecution, even death itself, they evidenced the supreme relevance in their ministry of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So the resurrection is the central tenet of our faith. And today I would like to look at the resurrection and the meaning that it has for us as believers. I'd like to look particularly at Matthew's account of the story of that first Sunday morning after Jesus' death upon the cross, the preceding Friday. Matthew tells us that the women set out very early in the morning to go to the tomb. At this point, they were filled with sorrow and grief. In fact, they were coming to anoint the body of Jesus, for they had not had the opportunity to do that. There being the Sabbath, immediately after Jesus was taken down from the cross, there was not sufficient time. And when the Sabbath began, they could not take out this task. And so they arrived at the tomb that morning. And as they arrived, Matthew tells us and records for us that there was literally an earth-shaking experience there. There was an earthquake, and an angel of the Lord in gleaming white came down and rolled back the huge stone that was there in front of the tomb. And there the angel sat upon that stone and spoke to the women. You can imagine how startled and even frightened they would have been. And his words to them were indeed startling, and yet they were also reassuring words. The angel said, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here." What an amazing statement. He is not here. They'd seen Jesus die an agonizing death, and they had watched his lifeless body lowered from the cross, and they had followed at a distance as he was carried to the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. And so their first thoughts on those words, "He is not here," is who has taken the Lord's body? Where could the body of Jesus be? But the very next words of the angel give them reassurance. He is risen. So that is the meaning of those first words, "He is not here." He is risen. He is alive. Jesus is not to be found here in the tomb among the dead. He has risen from the dead. Somebody said that the tomb, or the stone that blocked the tomb, was rolled away, not so that Jesus could arise and come out, but so that the disciples could go in and see that Jesus had already risen and was no longer there. There are many great men in history